Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old podcast, it is time for part 2 of the Mutiny on the Batavia. Welcome back to a story of just how horrible it was to travel long sea voyages in the 1600s. Shocking, I know. And it's about how one man, described as a mad heretic, formulated a plot to take over the ship. His name was Geronimus Cornelius, known as a mad heretic because he was born into a religion that was kind of like a militant religious communist jihad. It's kind of a quick way of describing it. And he had previously been an apothecary, but had tragedy befall him, and he was soon left bankrupt. After this, he hung out with hedonists, with Satanists, with witches, and his dream was to create his own kingdom, where he would be king, nay, maybe even God, to his own realm. And to do that, much like with a lot of things, you don't need some gold. And so, as an employee of the Dutch East India Company, he set sail on the Batavia, the pride and joy of the Dutch East India Fleet. It was sailing to, well, the city of Batavia, which is now called Jakarta, Indonesia. And during the 7-month voyage, he became very close with this skipper, Captain Aryan. And Aryan had developed hatred for the ship's commander, company man Francisco Pelsart, who happened to be Geronimus Cornelius' boss. And so, together, Geronimus and Aryan, they planned to mutiny, to seize the Batavia, a ship loaded with gold and jewels intended to purchase spices and to make friends in Southeast Asia. At first, they attacked the beautiful passenger Lucretia Jan's doctor, who Francisco had a crush on, in the hopes that Francisco would retaliate against the crew and instigate the mutiny himself. But Francisco held back, suspecting, something. And before they could try and take the ship again, it hit rocks off the coast of Western Australia and landed on a tiny chain of islands that had, let me see here, literally nothing on them. Aryan, Francisco, and about 40 others left the islands on a small boat intending to sail to Batavia for help, leaving a mad, murderous man in charge of 250 people. A mixture of sailors, soldiers, and passengers. What happened next is the bloodiest stranded on a desert island story in history. So let's give it a go. So, the islands they were now stuck on. Shite would be the word. No trees, no caves, barely any sand. No real grass or undergrowth. It's constantly windy from the endless surrounding ocean, and it's 50 miles from the coast of Australia, so good luck swimming there. And at this time, Australia was also largely an unknown. There were no European settlements there, and it wasn't mapped at all. And also some previous encounters with the Aboriginal Australians had not gone too well. Plus, this is Western Australia, and so the climate, it's pretty much the same as on the island, which is kind of sorta, very, very hot. Rocks, nothing else under the hot sun. I mean, and you're also in a place where not too far away is what's called Shark Bay, so good luck going for a swim. Like, if you Google map this place, you'll see the islands are just brown, sand-colored. There's no life there at all. Things were bad, and were going to get worse. They didn't have enough food or water for everyone, and even that would run out in a day or two. And run out it did. It had been raining in the week before they landed, but it hadn't rained in days. And so, as it went on, people began dying. Some, they drank their own pee. Some drank seawater. Others killed birds and sea lions for their blood. But, mercifully, on the 6th day, June 9th, A squall hit the islands and rainwater was collected. Lots and lots, so their supplies of fresh water were okay. Not great, but okay. Enough to make water not their number one priority. Now, Geronimus had actually stayed on the ship till it broke up, which was around the 9th of June. And he was there just drinking himself into a stupor, and when it finally did eventually collapse into the water, he floated on some wood for about 2 days before making it to the island the survivors were now on. Batavia's graveyard. Called Batavia's graveyard because it was beside where the ship had sank. And so, now, as the highest ranking member of the Dutch East India Company left, Geronimus was in charge. A position he accepted gracefully and humbly. Now, the vast majority of the people, they had no clue. They didn't know anything about the mutiny. News to them! And Geronimus wanted to keep it that way. But he did realize there was not enough food to go around. Even if they were at half rations, all the food would be gone in a few days. And, after about a week by this point on the islands, by this stage, they'd pretty much killed all the birds and all the sea lions. So that's now gone too. But Geronimus, now in charge, getting the respect he felt he deserved, he did not give one single shite about any of the others. The people he planned on killing on the ship now needed his protection, and his guidance as the leader, and he wasn't kind of feeling too great about that. And word about the mutiny on the ship, well, the attempted mutiny, that got out, and it began to spread among the survivors. See, some of the mutineers, they were pretty pissed off that Captain Aryan, he had abandoned them. He was their leader. And, also as leader, well, he was also the leader, figurehead, I suppose would be better because Geronimus was definitely the leader of the mutiny. He'd abandoned everybody. He had saved his own skin. What happened to fucking captain going down with the ship, etc., etc. So word spreading about the mutiny, it was not great. Not great for Geronimus Cornelius. See, if word got out, and a rescue ship did indeed come, slim as those chances were that Francisco, Aryan, and the others, the 40 people on that small ship, the chances of them actually making it were very, very slim. But it was a possibility, right? And so Geronimus knew that if a rescue ship came and word got back to Dutch authorities, he would be executed. So Geronimus, he couldn't risk a rescue. He could not risk going to the East Indies to Dutch authorities, in case they learned of the allegations against him. In fact, Geronimus, he had already planned out what to do if a rescue ship did happen to arrive. Well, see, he was thinking, right, a rescue ship wouldn't be a big ship. It would be a small one, 20 to 30 people on board. With his mutineers, even though they were still quite a small group at this point, he could take them, especially if, they were able to take the ship by surprise. So what they would simply do then is what they already tried to do on the Batavia. They would hijack the rescue ship and turn pirate with that, and then another ship appears, and then they hijack that. Seriously, that was the plan. They were gonna any rescue ship comes, we're gonna kill them, and we'll take that ship. Geronimus, he wanted power. And so now he planned on securing it on the island, as well as getting rid of some mouths. The first thing he did, along with his little gang of trusted mutineers, was gather all the weapons on the island and store them away where only he could access them. Next, he began sending out groups to the other surrounding islands to look for supplies and some water. Geronimus had actually already sent out a few of his trusted mutineers to search the other islands, and they came back, said, Geronimus, here, listen, there's nothing on any of these islands anywhere. There's no wells, there's no fresh water. Now, Geronimus was sending out more men. These were company loyalists he was now sending out, and people he didn't trust. I mean, he couldn't actually send out these guys and they find water, something useful, right? No. What he did was send out a group of hardened soldiers, led by a Weeba Haze. As I said, Geronimus knew these people were loyal to the company, so he sent them out to some island he already knew was barren to get rid of them. He told them, go out to this island, search for something useful, for food, for water, and if you find anything, light signal fires, and we'll come get you, because they had the rowing boats with them. Geronimus had absolutely no intention of following up with them if they did find anything. He was hoping he would abandon them on this island and they'd all die of thirst. He'd gotten rid of them. He sent out a few different groups to different islands to try and get rid of them. And now the population of Batavia's graveyard was reduced to about 150 people. But still, too many mouths to feed, especially if they had to settle in for the long haul waiting for a rescue ship. As I said, he would send other people out to the other islands under the same pretense. Find some water, then light a fire, and we'll be right there, we'll be right over. Of course, he was hoping all these people would die of dehydration or exposure. Then he started killing in July. He began by executing 3 men he accused of trying to escape the island. Next, he announced he would be sending more men to the other islands, like Weeba Haze's island, to assist them in their search for water. However, while on the little skiff being rowed by mutineers, when out of sight of the base camp, the loyalists were attacked, hands and feet bound with rope, and thrown overboard to drown. This was done a few times. And it had 2 benefits to Geronimus. 1, it reduced the number of mouths to feed and loyalists he may have to fight. And 2, many times when these people were attacked, they would beg for their lives. And so they would swear loyalty to the mutineers if they weren't killed. And pretty soon the number of mutineers would outweigh the number of others. It began with execution, but it would soon become open season. But not before something happened. See, Geronimus had sent out Weeba Haze and his soldiers to the island furthest from Batavia's graveyard. He knew, Weeba Haze and his soldiers, they're the only people who could really put up a fight. He expected them to die there. But then, on the 9th of July, smoke began to rise from Haze Island. He had found water. This, caused numerous problems for Geronimus. 1, he could no longer hide his intentions from the survivors on the island. Like, some still thought he was there to protect them, and he was executing people for just charges, even though they were bullshit. Geronimus was now clearly not going to go to that island for water. And it also meant that the group he was scared of most, the soldiers, they were still alive. And they were not going to die anytime soon. It also meant, if he didn't come for them, they would learn something was wrong. When Geronimus saw some of these survivors start to push their little boats and skiffs into the water to get to Haze Island, he gave the order. They started murdering the men and their children that had been going for the boats. 7 people were hacked down with swords on the beach in full view of everyone. Now, what Geronimus was planning was pretty open for all to see. A number of men, seeing which way the wind was blowing, they started pledging loyalty to him, and Geronimus would demand they show their loyalty. You can guess how. Usually, killing the children, and it was often quite open. The sick tent, that was one of the first places they went. There were 11 people in there suffering with scurvy and fevers. Their throats were slit as they lay. After that, anyone who got sick would be murdered right away. Pretty soon, there were 90 people left. The killing, it began to become just a way of dealing with the boredom. A lot of killings took place at night. The mutineers just wandering around, choosing victims at random. Soon, there were 60 people left. And then they began attacking the other islands which had survivors on them. Not Haze Island, of course, but an island opposite Batavia's graveyard, Seals Island. A group of mutineers rowed over and began chasing around and murdering everybody who was there. Everyone except the women. They chased them across this tiny island, clubbing, slashing, stabbing. Many were dragged out to the surf and drowned. One of the worst incidents was when a family of 7 were lured into their tent. Inside were 7 mutineers who blew out the lamp and began killing. They kept the father of the family alive, the man of the family, forcing him to work for them as a boatman, and he wasn't allowed to mourn his murdered wife and children. By late July, Geronimus had full control of the island. But there was still the other island, and it became like the Geronimus Cornelius versus Weeba Haze. They were like rivals, almost in a way. Weeba Haze, soldier, determined, a good survivor, disciplined. Geronimus, not a soldier, a company man, a manager type, but with a silver tongue, but not very good at strategy at all. So you got Geronimus and his mutineers, and Weeba Haze and his soldiers. There's about 20 of them, but that number would keep growing as survivors would make for Haze Island, knowing that Geronimus would kill them. But Geronimus, he had all the weapons. Remember, he had confiscated, one of the first things he did was confiscate all the weapons. Swords, pikes, he even had some muskets. The soldiers, they were highly trained and experienced, and they likely had some makeshift weapons. If it came hand-to-hand fighting, they would probably win against inexperienced sailors, only good at murdering defenseless children. And so the killings continued. Everyone except the women. When the Batavia set out, there were about 22 women on board. Most had died by this stage, murdered or of exposure or something. So, by late July, there were about 7 women left, including the beautiful Lucretia Jansdokter. And those women, well, the men had their pick. They were set aside for, quote, common service. Which meant probably what you think it means. It meant the mutineers could rape them whenever they wanted. They were turned into sex slaves for the mutineers. One of the women was actually married to a mutineer, and she too became a sex slave for, quote, common use, common service. No idea why her husband didn't stop that. I don't know, maybe he was afraid he'd be killed too. Except Lucretia, by the way. Geronimus, he called shotgun on her. He claimed her as his own. She was made to stay in his tent. Now, Geronimus, this fucking guy, he did not touch her for 2 weeks. He tried wooing her. He wrote poems, he gave her wine, but his silver tongue, it did not work on her. And when he realized she would not be willing, he went, well, it became unwilling. After time, the men, they started to go insane. They became deranged on the island. When the killing began, it had been to remove people who were draining the supplies, or to make sure the mutineers had control. And they just kind of kept going with it. Like, they were still killing, the rains had returned, fish were plentiful. But so killing and torture, that's how they, I guess for want of a better word, began to kill time. Meanwhile, on Haze Island, Weeba Haze and his soldiers, they were preparing. They weren't going to attack the mutineers, they didn't have the equipment, but they did prepare themselves for what they thought would be an eventual attack. See, their numbers had grown too. Various survivors, when fleeing the mutineers, they made it to Haze Island. And so they began to fashion, makeshift spears. They began to gather rocks, chunks of coral to throw, build defenses. And at the end of July, Geronimus planned to attack them. After all, if a rescue ship did indeed come, Haze and his group could not live to tell the story about what Geronimus was doing. Also on Haze Island, they found water, and there was no water on Batavia's graveyard other than the rain that fell, and that was pretty much almost gone by this stage too. And he also knew that Haze group, their number, it had grown quite a bit. So Geronimus, master manipulator, he had a plan to divide them. He wrote a letter and had it sent to a group of French mercenaries who were among Haze group. The letter said, Weeba Haze is going to abandon you. He's gonna leave you for dust. Join us. Now, this was fucking clear as day. So they didn't fall for it. And so, 3 days later, a group of about 20 mutineers began rowing over to Haze Island for fisticuffs for a fight to the death. Haze saw them coming from far away, and they were waiting for them on the beach, where these two groups ran at each other. There was a small skirmish, and the mutineers fled. Then the first week of August, about a week later, they attacked again. But this time, the mutineers actually ran from Haze and his soldiers before they even got close. The mutineers were not expecting Haze and his boyos to be quite so prepared. Then, about a month later, on the 2nd of September, Geronimus enacted another plan to take on Haze. This time, himself and a group would go over to Haze Island under the pretense of negotiations. We'll trade you clothing for some of your water. And Geronimus was hoping, a little bit of sneaky plan here going on. He was hoping that while him and Weeba were talking, his men could kind of shimmy, weasel their way in, persuade some of his men to join the mutineers.
Delightfully devilish.
So, Geronimus, he went over with a 5-man bodyguard. Geronimus and Weeba, they began chatting, yapping away. But once his cronies began to talk about, hey, maybe you should betray Weeba Haze, they were immediately attacked. The men and Geronimus surrendered. Only one of the mutineers escaped, a Wouter Luz. He was one of his bodyguards, and he managed to book it. He managed to escape the soldiers that were grabbing at him. He managed to book it and escape back to the main group of mutineers. Now, the main group of mutineers, they were waiting about a quarter-mile away on some muddy flats, watching what was going on. And once they saw the soldiers capturing Geronimus and his men, well, the entire whole group of mutineers began running towards them to attack and rescue their beloved leader. Weeba Haze, he saw this, and so what he did was he brought Geronimus and his now 4 bodyguards down to the beach. In full view of the main group of mutineers who were now ready to attack, Weeba ordered his men to execute 4 prisoners. All except Geronimus. It had the intended effect. The other mutineers, they called off the attack, as they knew Geronimus would be next. Geronimus Cornelius, he was then thrown into a pit and made to pluck birds, the feathers from birds that had been caught for food. From king pirate to plucking feathers. Very nice. So now, the 32 mutineers left elected a new leader. They elected Wouter Luz, the bodyguard of Geronimus who had escaped. And Wouter's first order of business? Attack Weeba Haze again. Early on the 17th of September, Wouter and his men attacked once more. But this time, they used the muskets they had. And this time, they saw success. They shot at the island for 2 hours and inflicted 3 severe casualties on Haze and his men. The plan was to keep them at long range and whittle them down. And it was working. And as Haze and his men realized time was running out, they grabbed at their makeshift clubs, ready to run at the mutineers. Run through the shallow water which would slow them down, giving the shooters ample time to kill more, where the mutineers were waiting for them with swords and with pikes. Just as Haze was about to give the order, a ship appeared on the horizon. Over 3 months before, Francisco and Captain Arian left with about 40 people to go get help. They initially sailed to Australia, hoping to find fresh water. But, as I said, Australia was poorly mapped at the time. They had no clue where the rivers might be. And if you look at maps of this part of Australia, a lot of the coast is what looks like just impassable cliffs. It's like looking at the edge of the world. It's barren and it's lifeless. And the cliffs were very, very, sometimes the cliffs would be 750 feet tall, straight into the ocean. There's nowhere really to land. And so this small group, what they did was they just kept following the coast north. All 40 of them. And their supplies dwindled very, very quickly. However, they made it. They sighted Java, Indonesia, almost 3 weeks after almost 3 weeks at sea. On the 7th of July, they finally landed in Batavia. Batavia was the capital of the Dutch colony in this part of the world. As I said, today it's the modern-day city of Jakarta. It had actually been Jakarta before. See, the native Javanese, they had previously been working with the English East India Company and playing the Dutch and the English against each other, as both the Dutch and the English wanted them spices. This resulted in attacks between the two private armies going against each other, and the Dutch ultimately won. They burned down what was there before, they burnt it down to the ground, and established Batavia, founded only 10 years before our story begins. It was founded in 1619. It was a Dutch town, and, looked at buildings made of brick, tiled roofs, straight roads, European style city. The people who lived there were some Chinese, but mostly Dutch who dressed in Dutch style, meaning heavy wool, even though it's a very tropical place. Style before substance, I guess. I mean, disease was rife, mosquitoes everywhere. Not great. The native Javanese, by the way, they were not allowed in the city walls. Yep. And just outside the city walls, it was pure jungle. Tigers roamed the area, there was bandits. But inside the city, it was safe enough. And the entire city was run by the Dutch East India Company. As I said in part 1, this was a time when company ruled, and the Dutch East India Company was more powerful than most countries, with its own private army, soldiers, cities, trades, everything. You combine all the top companies today, combine them together, they still don't equal how powerful and how valuable the Dutch East India Company was in the 1600s. And recently, the Dutch East India Company had been waging war against the Sultanate of Mataram, which was the last Javanese kingdom on the island of Java. There had just been a 3-month siege of Batavia, and the governor of Batavia, who was a man named Cohen, he had actually burned down parts of the city to deny it to the enemy, and then retreated back to the fortress. Now, when the siege ended, but when Francisco and Pelsart arrived, Batavia was not as splendid as they thought it was going to be. It was essentially a burned down city with everybody waiting for when the next attack would come. And Francisco Pelsart, he was immediately in the shit with the company when A, the Batavia had about $30 million in today's money worth of goods on her, which he had lost. Or, he didn't have. It wasn't in Batavia, so where is it? And B, those soldiers that had been on the ship, Weeba Haze and his group, they were needed in Batavia to help fight and establish the colony. So, yeah. Now, Francisco, he immediately blamed it on Captain Arian, telling Governor Cohen about his suspicions of sabotage and mutiny. Arian was thrown in the dungeons immediately for this. And a small ship, the Sardam, was to set sail immediately to recover any survivors, but more importantly, the treasure lost. A week after arriving in Batavia, the rescue ship set sail, with Francisco and a few others who had traveled with him aboard. There was about 26 people aboard. They reached the area of Batavia's graveyard by about the 10th of August. But Captain Arian, he was an idiot. When marking the longitude and the latitude of where the wreck was, he was off by about a third of a degree. Now, normally that small a mistake wouldn't be a big issue. But because these islands, they were so small and they were so low to the ground, they never got more than 6 feet above sea level, you could not see them. You could not find them. They were looking in the area for a month before they found them. Essentially, this rescue ship was going side to side for 4 weeks before they came to find the islands. By that stage, things were up shit creek. Just as the final battle was about to come to a bloody conclusion, both sides saw the Sardam rescue ship approach. For Weeba Haze and his group, rescue, thankfully. For the mutineers, justice. And not good justice for them. What happened next is comical, right? Listen to this. Both groups then began sprinting for the rescue ship. Weeba Haze and his group to tell about the evil mutineers. The mutineers to tell another story, that they were the victims. And hopefully overpower the rescuers and set sail on a life of piracy. Like they were both groups who were in little skiffs and both had the same distance to go to the rescue ship. They were both pedaling like mad. The rescue ship had anchored and they set out towards one of the islands. Francisco was stepping ashore when he heard Weeba Haze yell, "Welcome, but go back on board immediately, for there's a party of scoundrels on the islands near the wreck who have the intention to seize the ship." Haze and his men arrived first, and they managed to tell the tale of what really happened. And so, when the mutineers' boat approached, the swivel guns, which are small cannons on the side of the ship, were pointing right at him. There was a brief standoff, but the mutineers eventually laid down their weapons and were taken aboard, clapped in irons. Francisco Pelissart was pretty surprised to learn of what happened since he left 3 months prior. And pretty soon he learned that his second in command, Geronimus Cornelius, was responsible for it all. Geronimus was brought before Francisco, taken from the pit, covered in bird shit, and he denied any blame. Said if he did do anything, which I don't think I did, but if I did, I was forced to by the others. Yeah, of course he tried to immediately weasel his way out of it. All the mutineers, well, those that were living, were all locked up. First things first, right? The treasure. And most of it was recovered pretty quickly. Actually, Geronimus had been hoarding it in his tent, so a lot of it was there, including some Roman stuff, which is pretty cool, but they managed to recover the bulk of the treasure. And also in Geronimus' tent, they found sworn oaths written by the mutineers, were of them swearing allegiance to Geronimus. Hey, good man. Hey, always have it in writing. So, yeah. They remained there for a few weeks, and Francisco realized he should probably deal with a lot of mutineers here, rather than take them back on the ship where they could formulate another plan. Plus, it was already getting crowded. And so, he dealt with each mutineer one by one, calling witnesses, doing it proper, almost proper, we can say, the Dutch way. Not many were willing to admit to their crimes, no surprises, so torture was used to extract information. And this included on Geronimus. Their method of torture that they used was probably pretty much akin to waterboarding, something like that kinda. What they would do is stick a funnel in your mouth, keep pouring water in. Geronimus, he broke quickly under this. He did try and recant, though, his confession later, after admitting, under torture, what he'd done. He tried to recant what he'd said, but when he saw them reach for the funnel once more, he confessed again. On the 28th of September, his sentence was read by Francisco Pelissart. Because Geronimus Cornelius of Haarlem, aged about 30 years, apothecary, and later under merchant of the ship Batavia, has misbehaved himself so gruesomely and has gone beyond himself, has even been denuded of all humanity and has been changed as to a tiger, and because even under Moors and Turks, such unheard of, abominable misdeeds would not have happened, we, the undersigned persons of the council, in order to run us from the wrath of God and to cleanse the name of Christianity of such an unheard of villain, have sentenced the foresaid Geronimus Cornelius that he shall be taken to a place prepared to execute justice, and there first cut off both his hands, and after that punish him on a gallows under cord until death follows. The next day, Geronimus, he tried to poison himself before they could execute him. Where he got the poison, I don't know. I don't know if he made it from his apothecary skills, who knows? But it didn't kill him. It just gave him great pain and made him really, really sick. And then, on the 1st of October, the gallows were built, and they were ready for him. When he stood up there, Lucretia, she gave it to him. She shouted. She tore him a new asshole. Then, he kneeled, and with a hammer and chisel, yikes, both his hands were cut off. With a hammer and chisel, folks, that's a very gruesome way to do it. I don't know why they didn't just use an axe, but I guess they wanted it to be painful. And then, Geronimus, he had a rope around his neck. Now, at this point, trapdoors hadn't been invented yet. And so when you hung people back at this time, they created the frame, they had a rope hang, and then you would climb a ladder, and you would be pushed off. This meant that you would usually suffocate to death, rather than a quick neck snap. So it would be a long and painful way to go. It could take about 20 minutes. That was Geronimus Cornelius's fate. A number of others, they suffered the same. Others were taken back to Batavia. 2 were actually abandoned. 2 of the mutineers were actually abandoned in Australia, interestingly enough. One of whom was Waterloos, the person who commanded the mutineers after Geronimus was taken. They were given some equipment, water, food, and said, off you go, which, on one hand, they let them live, but on the other hand, yeah, but in a barren desert. But how they did, no one knows. Did they survive long? They had a fair chance. Can't say whatever happened to them. They would have been the first European settlers there, though, long before the British convict colonies of Botany Bay and such would have been established. But there was also actually, interestingly enough, some anecdotal tales of tribes in that area, Aboriginal tribes in the area, who were found to have European features. Some were found to have like grey eyes or light-coloured skin. So, who knows? And when they arrived back in Batavia, more of the mutineers were executed. But that would be the end of the saga. Francisco Pelsart, he was not left in good standing after the debacle. He would die within a year of disease. Lucretia, when she finally arrived in Batavia after suffering such a horrific ordeal, the journey itself was horrific, then, exposure on an island, then being Geronimus' sex slave, and then finally making it. And when she did, she found her husband was already dead. Fucking hell, after all that. Lucretia did not have an easy time either, as she would actually be accused of provoking the mutineers, straight up victim blaming her. Yeah, they straight up said they never would have done any of this, tried to take over, blah blah blah, if you weren't so hot, I guess. Yeah, the story of Lucretia Jansdottir, by the way, it's actually the basis of the sailor superstition of it being, unlucky to have women on board ships. Yeah, that superstition, it began with Lucretia being victim blamed for provoking men to mutiny. And so from that, suspicion began that if women are on board ships, they distract the male sailors and bad things can happen. Which is pretty shitty. Lucretia, she would marry again though, and later move back to Amsterdam. And what happened to Captain Arian after he was thrown in the dungeon? Unknown. He disappears from history after that. He probably perished in there. Weeba Haze, he was known forever after as a hero, and he even got a promotion to the rank of sergeant, which gave him a few extra dollary dues. Afterwards, he went and was garrisoned on one of the Dutch bases. And that is the story of the mutiny on the Batavia and the insane stranded on a desert island story that followed. The ship, the Batavia, it was rescued from the depths. Currently, surviving pieces of the actual ship are in museums in Western Australia. So, check that out, Western Australians. But that ends this old story. I want to thank you so much for listening to me tell this two-parter. Really, I spent a couple of weeks researching this. It caught my eye, and it's such an amazing story combined with history, combined with crazy crime stuff, which is my absolute favorite. But let's leave it there. Please, if you wouldn't mind rating and reviewing the podcast, that helps out so much. Thank you so much for that. And I will talk to you real soon in the next one. New podcast every Monday and every Friday with a new video every Tuesday on YouTube. As always, please take care of yourselves and each other. Because I love you. Mike out.